Tonight, we're diving into the darkest corners of Greek mythology, where gods are serial killers and family dinners literally involve eating the family. We're exploring the real versions of these ancient stories, the ones they definitely didn't teach you in school. You've woken up in ancient Greece, and the gods are laughing. Not with you at you. The morning light filtering through olive trees feels different here. Heavier somehow, as if the very air carries the weight of 1,000 untold horrors. You think you've stumbled into mythology, but you've actually stumbled into something far worse. The truth behind the stories they never told you in school. Before we descend into a divine nightmare of murder, hubris, and goat transformations, leave a comment telling us what country you're watching from and what time it is. This channel runs on chaos and global weirdos. The ground beneath your feet is stained with more than just wine. Here, in the cradle of civilization, where democracy was born and philosophy flourished, the gods were petty, vindictive, and had all the emotional stability of a toddler with omnipotent powers. You're not the hero of this story. You're barely even a footnote. You're just another mortal, standing in the shadow of Olympus, hoping the gods don't notice you exist. But they will notice. They always do. The olive groves around you whisper, with stories that would make modern horror writers weep with envy. These aren't the sanitized Disney versions of Greek myths. These are the original, uncut, director's edition nightmares that the ancient Greeks told around their fires when they wanted to remember why the world was so terrifying. Every stone here has witnessed unspeakable acts. Every temple has been built on foundations of divine cruelty, and every hero's journey ends in madness, death, or transformation into something that can no longer be called human. Welcome to a world where family reunions involve cannibalism, where loving parents murder their children for revenge, and where the god's idea of justice makes medieval torture look like a gentle massage. You're about to discover why the Greeks needed democracy, philosophy, and tragedy, because when your gods are psychopaths, you need every coping mechanism you can get. Let's start with the most fundamental truth about Greek mythology. The gods eat children, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The practice of cannibalism was deeply woven into Greek mythological narratives, often serving as the ultimate expression of divine punishment or mortal transgression. Picture this. You're at the world's worst dinner party, and your host is Tantalus, king of Phrygia. The marble halls echo with laughter and conversation. Golden goblets catch the firelight, and the aroma of roasted meat fills the air. But something's wrong. The other guests, the Olympian gods themselves, are unusually quiet. They're divine, faces frozen in expressions of growing horror. You notice something's off about the main course. The meat is ... familiar. Too familiar. Tantalus murdered his own son. Pelops cooked his body and served it to the gods at a banquet to test their all-knowing power. The smell of roasting flesh fills the air, but it's not lamb or beef. The sweet, horrifying scent of cooked human meat, served on golden platters to beings who supposedly represent divine perfection. The king stands proudly beside his culinary masterpiece, watching the gods' faces with the eager anticipation of a chef awaiting compliments. Imagine the preparation. Tantalus likely spent hours carefully butchering his own child, perhaps even humming as he worked. The methodical removal of limbs, the careful seasoning of human flesh, the slow roasting over sacred fires. Did Pelops scream? Did he beg his father for mercy? Or was he killed quickly before he could understand what was happening? The gods, thankfully, weren't fooled. Well, except for Demeter. who was so distracted by grief over her daughter Persephone that she accidentally ate Pelops' shoulder, the goddess of the harvest, responsible for all growing things, consuming human flesh in her distraction. The irony is almost beautiful in its horror. The deity who feeds humanity accidentally feeding on humanity. The gods sought to undo Tantalus's crime by rebuilding Pelops from the ground up, with Hephaestus crafting a new shoulder from ivory. Imagine the grotesque resurrection, bones reassembling in a cauldron like some divine jigsaw puzzle, flesh knitting itself back together with the sound of wet fabric, sinew reattaching with audible pops, and an ivory shoulder gleaming white against restored skin. The boy emerges from this divine surgery more beautiful than before, but forever marked by his father's cream, a walking reminder that even gods can be tricked into participating in the ultimate taboo. For this ultimate act of hubris, attempting to trick the gods into cannibalism, Tantalus received the punishment we all know: eternal starvation and thirst in Hades. But the details make it worse. The punishment was eternal frustration, a profound violation of the most basic principles of civilized existence. Tantalus stands in a pool of water that recedes whenever he bends to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches lift away whenever he reaches for food. But here's the truly insidious part. He's not just hungry and thirsty. He's eternally experiencing the anticipation of satisfaction that never comes. Every time he reaches for food, his mouth waters, his stomach clenches with hunger, his mind fills with the imagined taste of fruit. Every time he bends toward water, his throat contracts with the phantom sensation of swallowing, his body preparing for the relief that will never arrive. It's psychological torture disguised as physical punishment. You see, in Greek mythology, some families are just cursed. The house of Atreus, Tantalus's descendants, became a hereditary nightmare factory. Tantalus's violation of sacred laws, betrayal, and attempted cannibalism initiated a cycle of violence and retribution that plagued his family for generations. Generation after generation would repeat the same patterns: infanticide, revenge, betrayal, and the consumption of their own children. His son Atreus would later serve his brother Thyestes' children to their father at a feast, continuing the family tradition of culinary horror. Thyestes' surviving son would kill Atreus in revenge. Atreus' son, Agamemnon, would sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to the gods, and his wife Clytemnestra would murder him for it. Each generation found new ways to destroy their own blood, as if the very concept of family love had been corrupted at its source. The Greeks understood something profound about trauma. It echoes through generations, transforming love into violence and protection into destruction. The curse of Tantalus wasn't just his eternal punishment. It was the way his crime poisoned every relationship that came after, turning the most basic human bonds into weapons of mutual annihilation. But Tantalus wasn't the first to feast on his offspring. That honor belongs to Cronus, whose story makes Tantalus look like a merely disturbed dinner host. Cronus systematically devoured each of his children immediately after birth, motivated by a prophecy that one of them would overthrow him. The prophecy came from his parents, Gaia and Uranus, whom Cronus had already betrayed by castrating his father with a sickle. The words rang in his ears like a curse: "One of your children will do to you what you did to me." So Cronus decided on the most logical solution: them all before they could grow up to challenge him. Imagine being Rhea, watching your husband consume baby after baby. The desperate screams of newborns cut short by the wet sound of divine jaws closing around tiny bodies. Each birth became a death sentence, each moment of maternal joy transformed into absolute horror. The metallic taste of fear would fill her mouth as she watched Cronus's throat work, swallowing their children whole like some cosmic snake. Picture the routine. Rhea's labor pains. The moment of birth when joy should flood. A mother's heart, the brief seconds of holding her child before Cronus arrives. His massive hands, still stained with ichor from his latest divine battle, reaching for the infant. The baby's cries echoing off the cavern walls before being muffled forever. Rhea's desperate pleading falling on ears deafened by paranoia and power. 5 children met this fate: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, each one sliding down their father's throat into his stomach, where they remained alive but trapped in a flesh prison of divine gastric juices. Think about that for a moment. They weren't killed by the consumption. They were imprisoned in their father's digestive system, conscious and aware, for years. What was it like inside Cronus's stomach? The gods were immortal, so they couldn't die, couldn't even lose consciousness. They would have been aware of every moment, the acidic burn of digestive fluids, the claustrophobic darkness, the rhythmic sounds of their father's breathing and heartbeat above them. Did they try to communicate with each other? Did they plan their eventual escape? Or did they simply endure, growing slowly mad in their fleshy prison? The space would have been cramped. 5 fully grown gods sharing a stomach meant for one. They would have felt each other's bodies pressed against them, heard each other's breathing, shared each other's fear and rage. Imagine Hades, future lord of the underworld, learning about death by experiencing a kind of living burial. Picture Poseidon, future god of the sea, drowning slowly in his father's digestive acids while remaining forever alive. When Zeus was born, Rhea finally broke. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and watched as Cronus devoured it without question. His parental instincts so completely overridden by fear that he couldn't tell the difference between his child and a rock. The god who ruled time itself was so blinded by anxiety about the future that he couldn't see the present clearly enough to notice he was eating stone. Meanwhile, the real Zeus was spirited away to grow up in secret on the island of Crete, nursed by a goat named Amalthea and guarded by warriors called the Curids, who clashed their shields to hide his cries. The imagery here is perfect. The future king of the gods, raised by animals and soldiers, while his father unknowingly digested stones. The warriors who protected Zeus did so by making noise. Their shield clashing created a constant din that masked any sounds the baby might make. Imagine the cacophony, metal ringing against metal in endless, overlapping rhythms, creating a wall of sound that would drive any normal person insane. But for Zeus, this chaos became a lullaby, the sound of protection, the noise that meant he was safe from his father's hunger. When Zeus finally forced Cronus to vomit up his siblings, they emerged, fully grown, having somehow matured while trapped in their father's stomach. Imagine that moment of liberation, the sudden, violent expulsion of gods from their father's throat, covered in bile and gastric acid, but ready for war. They had spent years planning this moment, growing stronger despite their confinement, turning their imprisonment into preparation for revolution. The sound alone would have been horrific. The wet retching of a god regurgitating other gods, the splash of divine vomit hitting stone floors, the gasping of beings breathing free air for the first time in years. And then the moment of recognition, 5 siblings seeing each other's faces for the first time, realizing they were no longer alone, that their shared nightmare had finally ended. But the psychological damage was done. These gods had learned. Their first lessons about power from being literally consumed by their father. Is it any wonder that their future relationships would be marked by paranoia, violence, and the casual abuse of those weaker than themselves? If you think parental love might provide some sanctuary in Greek mythology, you haven't met Medea. She represents perhaps the most disturbing truth about these myths. Sometimes, the people who should protect you are the ones who destroy you most, completely. Medea's infanticide has become one of the most famous and horrifying stories in Greek mythology. But what makes it truly disturbing is the calculated nature of her revenge. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was psychological warfare, at its most refined and brutal. Jason, her husband, had decided to trade up for a younger model, Glos, daughter of King Creon of Corinth. The reasoning was, political marrying into the royal family would secure Jason's position and provide better opportunities for advancement. Medea, the foreign sorceress who had helped him obtain the Golden Fleece, who had betrayed her own family for him, who had murdered her own brother to help him escape, was now inconvenient. Used goods, yesterday's wife. Imagine Medea's rage, not just the fury of a woman scorned, but the deeper rage of someone who has sacrificed everything, family, homeland, moral boundaries only, to be discarded when no longer useful. She had committed unspeakable acts for Jason's love, and now he was casting her aside like a worn-out tool. Medea's original plan was to murder Jason, Glos, and Creon, but her wrath quickly escalated to include her own children. She reasoned that the satisfaction of making Jason suffer would triumph over her own sadness at killing them. Here's where the myth becomes truly psychologically disturbing. This is a mother performing a cost-benefit analysis on murdering her own children. The method was pure genius in its cruelty. First, she sent Glos a beautiful dress and golden crown as wedding gifts, apparently reconciling herself to the new marriage and offering congratulations. The garments were soaked in poison that would cause agonizing death when worn. Picture the scene, Glos excitedly unwrapping the gifts, admiring their beauty, perhaps even feeling sorry for Medea's gracious acceptance of defeat. As soon as Glos put on the dress, the poison began its work. The fabric adhered to her skin like molten metal. The crown burned into her skull, and her flesh literally began melting as she writhed in agony. Her screams would have echoed through the palace, bringing her father Creon running to help. When he tried to pull the dress from her body, the poison transferred to him, and he died in the same horrible fashion, his skin sloughing off, his body consumed by chemical fire. But that wasn't enough for Medea. She reasoned that the satisfaction she would feel in making Jason suffer the loss of his children would greatly triumph over the sadness she would feel upon killing them. Listen to that logic. She's weighing her anticipated pleasure in Jason's pain against her anticipated grief at infanticide. This is maternal love perverted into its exact opposite. Mother's protectiveness turned inside out into a weapon. What's even more chilling is that Euripides probably invented the variation where Medea murders her own children. Earlier versions had the children killed by Corinthians or dying accidentally. The playwright created this particular horror because it was dramatically more powerful. Think about that. Someone sat down and deliberately crafted the story of a mother murdering her children because it would make for better theater. The actual murders would have been intimate, personal. These weren't enemies killed in battle, they were her own babies, children who trusted her completely, who came to her for comfort and protection. She would have had to look into their eyes as she killed them, would have heard them call for her to save them from the very danger she represented. Euripides instilled a sense of sympathy in Medea's actions, noting she was motivated by motherly love. The truly disturbing part isn't that she killed the myths, that she convinced herself it was an act of love. She was protecting them from the humiliation and suffering they would face as the children of a discarded foreign wife, from growing up as reminders of their father's shameful past. In her twisted logic, death was preferable to dishonor. But this reasoning reveals something profound about Greek society's values. Reputation mattered more than life, honor more than happiness, and a mother's love could be so possessive that it became murderous. After the murders, Medea escaped in a chariot drawn by dragons sent by her grandfather Helios, the sun god. She literally flew away from the consequences of her actions, carrying the bodies of her children with her. Jason was left standing in the ruins of his new life, surrounded by the corpses of his wife, his father-in-law, and now learning that his children were dead too all because he wanted a better marriage arrangement. If you think the humans in Greek mythology are disturbing, wait until you meet their divine punishment. The punishment of Prometheus represents divine cruelty at its most creative and sustained. Prometheus was chained to Mount Caucasus for eternity and subjected to relentless torture by having an eagle feed on his liver. But it's not just the torture, it's the precision of it. The eagle would consume his liver during the day, and every night the liver would regenerate, providing fresh torture each morning. This wasn't random violence. It was carefully engineered suffering designed to last forever. Picture the daily routine: dawn breaking over the Caucasus Mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of pink and gold. The shadow of wings as the eagle approaches, circling. Once before landing on Prometheus's chest with talons that sink deep enough to crack ribs. The sharp pain as the beak pierces flesh. The wet sound of tearing through muscle and sinew. The hot splash of blood on stone. The eagle would methodically devour the organ while Prometheus remained conscious, his immortal nature ensuring he felt every moment of the torture. There would be no merciful unconsciousness, no shock-induced numbness, just pure, unending agony as his liver was consumed piece by piece. The bird would take its time, savoring each bite, while Prometheus screamed, himself hoarse against the mountain wind. But the psychological torture was worse than the physical. Every night, as his liver regenerated, Prometheus would feel it growing back. The strange sensation of organ regeneration, the gradual return of function, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring identical suffering. He couldn't even enjoy the relief of healing because it only meant the torture could begin again. What did Prometheus do to deserve this? He gave fire to humanity. Zeus had taken fire away from humans as punishment after Prometheus tricked him during a sacrificial offering, leaving mortals to freeze and starve in darkness. The crime was compassion caring about mortal suffering enough to defy the king. Of the gods, the trick that started it all was brilliant in its simplicity. When gods and mortals were dividing a sacrificial ox, Prometheus created two piles, one containing the best meat hidden under unappetizing stomach lining, the other containing bones covered in appetizing fat. Zeus chose the pile that looked better, bones and fat leaving the good meat for humans. This established the precedent that humans would keep the best parts of sacrifices for themselves, while offering the bones and fat to the gods. Zeus's reaction was disproportionate even by divine standards. Not only did he take fire away from humans, condemning them to cold and darkness, but when Prometheus stole it back, Zeus devised the most elaborate punishment possible. The message was clear. Compassion for mortals was a crime against divine order. The conditions for Prometheus's release were typically divine in their impossibility. Zeus told Prometheus he could be freed if he would reveal the name of the mother, whose child would dethrone Zeus, or if an immortal would give their life for him, an immortal could kill the eagle. These conditions seemed like a high price. So Prometheus endured the torture for centuries. Think about the mental fortitude required, waking up every morning knowing that in a few hours an eagle would arrive to eat your liver, experiencing that torture daily for thousands of years, and still refusing to break. Eventually, the centaur, Chiron, volunteered his life in place of Prometheus, and Heracles killed the eagle and broke the unbreakable chains. But by then, Prometheus had endured millennia of daily torture, his liver eaten and regenerated thousands of times, his screams echoing across the mountains as a warning to anyone who might consider defying the gods. The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic after so much suffering. Heracles simply shot the eagle with an arrow and broke chains that had been called unbreakable. The ease of the actual rescue made the years of torture seem even more pointless. Zeus could have freed Prometheus at any time, but chose not to, maintaining the punishment long after any possible lesson had been learned. When Prometheus was finally unchained, his first words weren't of gratitude or relief. They were of continued defiance. Even after an eternity of torture, he regretted nothing about helping humanity. This wasn't just stubbornness. It was a philosophical statement about the value of compassion over obedience. Let's talk about the Minotaur, because nothing says advanced civilization like feeding teenagers to a monster in a basement. The legendary King Minos of Crete demanded that Athens send 7 young men and 7 young women every 7 to 9 years to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. The Minotaur itself was the product of divine punishment and unnatural desire. Queen Persephone had been cursed by Poseidon with an infatuation for a white bull after Minos failed to sacrifice the animal as intended. The resulting offspring, half human, half bull, was hidden away in a labyrinth designed by Daedalus, where it fed on human flesh. But let's talk about the human cost. Archaeological evidence from Minoan sites like Knossos reveals altar-like structures, bone remnants, and ceremonial paraphernalia suggesting possible ritual sacrifices. Excavations in the 1980s discovered mass grave sites filled with children's bones, bearing marks indicating violent death and butchering similar to how one would butcher a lamb. The young Athenians were required to go unarmed and would either be consumed by the Minotaur or get lost and perish in the labyrinth. Imagine being one of these teenagers, selected by lottery, knowing your death would be prolonged and horrifying. The selection process itself was a form of psychological torture. Every young person in Athens lived with the knowledge that they might be chosen. The ship journey to Crete would have been a floating tomb, filled with young people saying goodbye to life before they'd really begun to live it. Picture the conversations, some trying to maintain false hope, others making peace with their fate, still others breaking down completely. The parents who came to see them off, knowing they were watching their children sail to certain death. The labyrinth itself was designed to be inescapable. Daedalus created such an intricate maze that even he needed Ariadne's thread to help Theseus escape after killing the Minotaur. The walls were high enough to prevent climbing, complex enough to ensure confusion, and designed with acoustic properties that would carry the screams of victims throughout the structure. But here's the truly horrifying detail. The labyrinth wasn't just meant to contain the Minotaur. It was designed to maximize the terror of the human sacrifices. The maze was built so that victims would wander for days, hearing the creature moving through adjacent passages, knowing death was approaching, but not knowing when or from which direction. The Minotaur itself was described as having the body of a man, but the head and appetite of a bull. This creature would have been capable of human intelligence, but driven by animal hunger, possibly the worst combination imaginable. It could anticipate its victims' movements, understand their fear, but feel no empathy or mercy. When Theseus finally arrived to end the sacrifice, he carried a sword hidden in his belongings and the guidance of Ariadne, who provided him with thread to find his way out. The battle with the Minotaur would have been brutal hand-to-hand combat with a creature that possessed both human cunning and animal strength, fought in near-total darkness in the depths of a maze. The aftermath was almost as disturbing as the original crime. After killing the Minotaur, Theseus took Ariadne with him, but then abandoned her on the island of Naxos while she slept. The woman who saved him and ended the human sacrifices was discarded like the foreign wife, Medea apparently. Gratitude had limits when it came to inconvenient women. You thought the family murders were bad? Welcome to the Zeus chapter, where the king of the gods turned sexual assault into an art form. His story reads less like mythology and more like a criminal case file, complete with multiple victims, pattern behavior, and a disturbing tendency toward targeting the vulnerable. Zeus often transformed himself to seduce, abduct, or rape mortal women, and his repertoire of forms reads like a supernatural predator's handbook. He became a swan to rape Leda, a bull to abduct Europa, a shower of gold to impregnate Danae, and even disguised himself as Artemis to assault Callisto. Each transformation was carefully calculated to exploit his victims' specific vulnerabilities or circumstances. The Europa myth is particularly disturbing in its predatory calculation. Zeus recognized that approaching Europa in his divine form would be overwhelming or deadly for a mortal. So he transformed into a magnificent white bull. He didn't just pick any form, he chose one that would appeal to a young woman's nurturing instincts, appearing gentle and beautiful in the meadows where she played with her friends. Picture the scene: Europa, a Phoenician princess, walking through flower-strewn fields with her companions, laughing and picking blooms for garlands. The morning air is sweet with the scent of hyacinths and roses. Birds sing in the nearby trees, and everything feels safe and innocent. Then this gorgeous white bull appears, more beautiful than any creature they've ever seen, with eyes that seem almost human in their intelligence. Zeus, in bull form, lay down beside Europa, allowing her to pet his snowy flanks and eventually encouraging her to climb onto his back. The deception was perfect. She trusted him completely, even braiding flowers into his horns as her friends watched and laughed. As soon as Europa was seated, Zeus charged toward the sea and began swimming rapidly away from the Phoenician shore. Picture the terror. A young woman realizing she's trapped on the back of a divine predator, watching her homeland disappear across the waves, her friends' screams growing fainter as the distance increases. Her hands, still stained with flower pollen, now grip white fur wet with sea spray as she struggles not to fall into the churning waters. She calls for her father, for her brothers, for any god who might save her, but the only God who hears her is the one carrying her toward her doom. When they reached Crete, Zeus revealed his true form and raped her. She bore him 3 children, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. The continent of Europe was named after her lasting monument to divine sexual violence, ensuring that her trauma would be remembered every time someone spoke of the Western world. The Leda's story is even more explicit in its violence and biological impossibility. Zeus raped Leda by taking the form of a swan, and her pregnancy resulted in her delivering 2 eggs. Think about the practical mechanics of this assault. A massive swan attacking a human woman, the impossible physiology of the union, the trauma of laying eggs instead of giving birth normally. The eggs hatched to reveal Helen and Pollux from Zeus, and Castor and Clytemnestra from her mortal husband, Tyndareus, because apparently she was pregnant by 2 different fathers simultaneously. Helen, born from rape, would grow up to become the face that launched 1,000 ships, her beauty causing the Trojan War and the deaths of thousands. Even her legendary beauty was tainted by its violent origin. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing assault was that of Callisto. Zeus seduced her while disguised as Artemis. The very goddess Callisto served as a virgin huntress. Imagine the layers of betrayal. Callisto had devoted her life to serving Artemis, taking vows of chastity, dedicating herself to the hunt and the wild places. She trusted Artemis completely, saw her as a protector and guide. When Zeus appeared in Artemis's form, Callisto would have felt nothing but joy and reverence. She was being visited by her beloved goddess, perhaps being chosen for some special honor or quest. The assault came disguised as divine favor, making it impossible for her to resist or even understand what was happening until it was too late. The aftermath was even crueler. When Artemis discovered Callisto's pregnancy during a communal bath, she flew into a rage and transformed her faithful servant into a bear. So Callisto was first sexually assaulted by a god disguised as her patron deity, then punished by that same deity for being violated. She lost her human form, her ability to speak, her place among the huntresses, everything that had given her life meaning. As a bear, Callisto was hunted by the very women who had once been her sisters, forced to flee from people who would have died for her when she was human. She lived in constant fear, unable to explain who she was, watching her son Arcas grow up from a distance, knowing that if he encountered her, he might try to kill her, not recognizing his mother in her cursed form. The cruelest irony is that Zeus eventually placed her among the stars as the constellation Ursa Major. The great bear, even his gesture of apparent mercy was tainted. She became a permanent reminder of her own violation, wheeling across the sky each night, visible to every generation that came after. Her trauma literally written in the stars. But Zeus's appetite wasn't limited to elaborate transformations. Sometimes his methods were more direct and equally disturbing. Take Danae, imprisoned by her father, Acrisius, in a bronze underground chamber because of a prophecy that her son would kill him. Zeus appeared to her as a shower of golden rain, penetrating through the metal walls that were supposed to protect her. Think about Danae's situation, locked underground in a bronze cell, cut off from sunlight and human contact, slowly going mad. From isolation, when the golden rain began to fall in her cell, it might have seemed like divine mercy, like Zeus was bringing her light and warmth. Instead, it was another assault, the god literally seeping through her defenses in liquid form. The child born from this union was Perseus, who would indeed fulfill the prophecy by accidentally killing his grandfather with a discus. So Zeus's rape didn't just traumatize Danae, it set in motion the very fate Acrisius had tried to prevent, making the imprisonment and violation completely pointless, except as exercises in divine cruelty. If Zeus was bad, his wife Hera was arguably worse, not because she was more violent, though she certainly was violent, but because her rage was always misdirected. Instead of punishing her serial rapist husband, she tormented his victims and their children, turning divine marriage into an endless cycle of vengeance against the innocent. Consider Io, one of Hera's most tortured victims. Zeus had an affair with this priestess of Heraeus, Hera's own priestess, and, when his wife grew suspicious, he transformed Io into a white heifer to hide her. But Hera wasn't fooled. She asked Zeus for the beautiful cow as a gift, trapping Io in animal form under her direct control. Hera then set Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, to watch Io constantly. Imagine being trapped in the body of a cow, retaining human consciousness but unable to speak, unable to explain your identity to anyone, while a monster with eyes covering his entire body stares at you without ever blinking. Argus never slept, because some of his eyes were always awake, making escape impossible. When Zeus finally sent Hermes to kill Argus by lulling him to sleep with music, Hera's revenge escalated. She sent a gadfly to torment Io, driving her across the known world in an endless, maddening journey. The fly would bite and sting constantly, giving Io no rest, no peace, forcing her to run until her hooves were bloody and her cow's body was exhausted, only to be stung again into motion. Io wandered across continents through Greece, Asia, and Africa, able to communicate with humans, who saw only a mad cow being chased by a persistent fly. She couldn't eat properly because the gadfly would attack whenever she tried to graze. She couldn't sleep because the stinging would wake her. For years, she lived in a constant state of tortured exhaustion, her human mind trapped in an animal body that was being systematically driven insane. The geographic scope of her suffering was staggering. The Ionian Sea was named after her. The Bosphorus means cow crossing in reference to her passage, and her journey took her through lands that would become the stuff of legend. She was a living map of divine cruelty, her path across the ancient world marking the distances that divine vengeance could reach. When Io finally reached Egypt, Zeus restored her human form, and she bore him a son, Epaphus. But even then, Hera wasn't finished. She had the child kidnapped, forcing Io to search for him across another continent. The message was clear. There was no statute of limitations on divine revenge, no distance great enough to escape Hera's wrath, no suffering sufficient to pay for the crime of being desired by Zeus. Hera's treatment of Heracles was even more systematic and cruel. From the moment of his birth, she tried to kill him, sending serpents to his cradle when he was still an infant. When that failed, she drove him mad, causing him to murder his own wife and children in a fit of divine-induced insanity. Picture that scene: Heracles, the strongest man who ever lived, suddenly losing all recognition of reality. His beloved wife Megara becomes an enemy in his eyes. His children transform into monsters that must be destroyed. He kills them with his bare hands, using the same strength that made him a hero to commit the most unheroic act imaginable. When the madness lifts, he finds himself standing among the corpses of everyone he loved most. The 12 labors that followed weren't heroic quests, they were penance for divinely induced infanticide, a punishment for crimes he committed while not in control of his own mind. Each labor was designed to be impossible, a way of tormenting him with the hope of redemption that Hera never intended to grant. But perhaps Hera's cruelest victim was Lamia, a Libyan queen who had an affair with Zeus. Hera killed all of Lamia's children except Scylla, then cursed Lamia with insomnia so she could never escape the memory of their deaths. When you can't sleep, you can't dream, can't find even temporary refuge from grief. Lamia was forced to remain conscious every moment, thinking about her dead children, reliving their deaths over and over with perfect clarity. The curse drove Lamia completely insane. She became a child-eating monster, devouring other women's babies in an attempt to ease her own grief by spreading it. But the worst part of the curse was that Hera gave her removable eyes, allowing her to take them out when she wanted to rest them, but never allowing her to sleep. So she could achieve physical relief for her eyes, but never mental relief from her anguish. Greek mythology is obsessed with transformation, but these aren't the gentle metamorphoses of fairy tales. They're body horror at its most visceral, turning the human form into a weapon of divine punishment or a cage for tortured consciousness. Take Arachne, a mortal weaver whose only crime was being too good at her craft. She challenged Athena to a weaving contest and created a tapestry depicting the gods' crimes, particularly Zeus's many rapes. Her work was flawless, technically perfect, and worst of all, truthful. Athena's response was to beat her with a shuttle, and then transform her into a spider. But this wasn't just a change of form, it was a perversion of everything Arachne valued. As a spider, she retained her weaving ability, but lost the capacity to create art. She could only spin webs for survival, trap flies for food, and live in dark corners where people would try to kill her on sight. Her greatest talent became a mere survival mechanism. Her artistic vision reduced to predatory necessity. The transformation preserved just enough of her humanity to make it torture. She remembered being human, remembered creating beautiful tapestries, remembered the feel of fine threads between her fingers. But now her threads were extruded from her own body. Her weaving was sticky and utilitarian, and her audience consisted of insects she had to eat to live. Athena's punishment was especially cruel because it was so precisely targeted. Arachne loved to weave, so she would weave forever, but never again create anything beautiful. She was proud of her skill, so she retained that skill, but it would only inspire fear and disgust. She valued artistic truth, so she would live with the truth of what she had become. Even more disturbing is the story of Actaeon, a young hunter who accidentally saw Artemis bathing. He didn't seek her out, didn't try to spy on her, he simply stumbled upon her by chance while hunting deer. But Artemis, the virgin goddess, couldn't tolerate any mortal seeing her naked, so she transformed him into a stag. Think about the practical horror of this transformation. Actaeon didn't just look like a deer, he became one mentally as well as physically. His human consciousness was trapped inside an animal brain driven by deer instincts. He tried to call out to his hunting companions for help, but only bleating sounds emerged from his throat. His own hunting dogs, trained to track and kill deer, caught his scent and began pursuing him. These were animals he had raised from puppies, who had slept by his fire and eaten from his hand. Now they saw him only as prey, their loyalty and affection completely overridden by their training. The chase would have been terrifying beyond description. Actaeon retained enough human intelligence to understand what was happening, but couldn't communicate with his dogs or remember how to escape their tactics, because he had taught them those tactics. He was being hunted by his own knowledge, killed by his own hounds. Using methods he had perfected, when they finally brought him down, they tore him apart while he was still alive. The dogs who had once licked his face now ripped his throat out. The animals who had been his closest companions became his executioners. They carried pieces of his body back to his fellow hunters as trophies, not understanding that they were presenting their masters' remains to his friends. Greek mythology is filled with prophecies that come true precisely because people try to prevent them. creating a universe where knowledge of the future becomes a form of cosmic torture. The gods give mortals glimpses of their fate, not as warnings to help them, but as psychological weapons to make their suffering worse. King Laius of Thebes received a prophecy that his son would kill him and marry his wife. His response was to pierce the infant's ankles with iron pins and abandon him on a mountainside to die. But the baby Oedipus was rescued, raised by another royal family, and grew up not knowing his true identity. When Oedipus learned from the oracle at Delphi that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother, he fled what he believed was his home, trying to escape the prophecy. Instead, he ran directly into its fulfillment. On the road, he encountered Laius in a chariot and killed him in a fight over right-of-way, not recognizing the stranger as his father. Arriving in Thebes, Oedipus solved the riddle of the Sphinx and was rewarded with marriage to the recently widowed queen, Jocasta, his own mother. They ruled happily for years, had 4 children together, and believed they had escaped fate's designs. The slow revelation of the truth is where the real horror lies. Oedipus began investigating the murder of the previous king to lift a plague from Thebes, not knowing he was investigating his own crime. Each clue he uncovered brought him closer to a truth that would destroy everything he valued: his identity, his marriage, his children's legitimacy, his place in the world. When the truth finally emerged, Jocasta hanged herself and Oedipus gouged out his own eyes with her brooches. But the self-mutilation wasn't just desperate, was symbolic justice. The eyes that had failed to see the truth, that had looked upon his mother as a wife and his father's corpse as a stranger, deserved to be destroyed. Think about Oedipus's psychological state in those final moments of sight. Looking around the palace where he had lived as king, seeing the bed where he had slept with his mother, the children who were simultaneously his offspring and his siblings, the crown he had won through patricide. Every familiar object became evidence of monstrous crimes. The prophecy hadn't just predicted the future, it created it. If Laius hadn't tried to kill his son, Oedipus would have grown up knowing his parents and never would have killed his father or married his mother. The attempt to escape fate became the mechanism of its fulfillment. But the curse didn't end with Oedipus. His children inherited their father's doom. His sons, Iticles and Polynices, killed each other in battle, and his daughter Antigone was buried alive for defying royal decree. The family's attempts to escape prophecy had created a generational curse that consumed everyone it touched. Some of the most disturbing figures in Greek mythology aren't gods or monsters. They're the humans who enabled divine cruelty through their ingenuity. Daedalus, the master craftsman, represents the horror of genius without moral constraints, creating instruments of torture and death with the same skill others might use to create beauty. Commissioned by King Minos to contain the Minotaur, Daedalus designed the labyrinth as a perfect prison. But this wasn't just a maze, it was a psychological torture device designed to maximize suffering. The passages were arranged to create false hope, leading victims to believe they were escaping only to deposit them back where they started. The acoustic properties were carefully engineered so that screams would echo throughout the structure, ensuring that each new victim would hear the death cries of those who came before. The lighting was designed to create disorienting shadows that would make distance and direction impossible to judge. Every architectural element served the purpose of prolonging terror, but Daedalus's masterpiece wasn't the labyrinth, it was the wooden cow he built for Queen Pasiphae to facilitate her union with the bull. Think about the engineering required. A hollow wooden sculpture, realistic enough to fool a bull. with mechanisms that would allow a human woman to position herself inside it. For sexual intercourse with an animal, the project would have required detailed study of bovine anatomy and behavior, careful construction to ensure structural integrity during the act, and ventilation systems to prevent suffocation. Daedalus approached the task of enabling bestiality with the same methodical precision he brought to architecture and sculpture. The Minotaur was the direct result of his craftsmanship, a monster that wouldn't have existed without his technical expertise. Then he was commissioned to build a prison for the creature he had helped create, designing a structure that would claim hundreds of lives over the years. Daedalus was both creator and warden of horror, profiting from each stage of the process. When he finally tried to escape Crete with his son Icarus, using wings of his own design, the flight became another tragedy of his making. He had created the means of escape, but failed to account for human nature, his son's excitement, and the intoxicating freedom of flight. Icarus flew too close to the sun, the wax holding his wings melted, and he fell into the sea. Daedalus watched his son fall from the sky, knowing that his own ingenuity had made the death possible. The wings that promised freedom became instruments of destruction. The escape plan became a funeral. Even his paternal love was mediated through technology that proved fallible when it mattered most. The god's concept of justice reveals the most disturbing aspect of Greek mythology. The universe is run by beings whose moral reasoning is fundamentally alien to human understanding. Divine punishment isn't about rehabilitation or deterrence. It's about artistic expression through suffering. Consider the punishment of the Danaids, the 50 daughters of Danaus who were forced to marry their 50 cousins, the sons of Egypt. On their wedding night, 49 of them murdered their husbands as instructed by their father. Only Hypermnestra spared her husband Lynceus because he respected her virginity. In the afterlife, the 49 murderous sisters were condemned to fill a bathtub with water using jars full of holes. For eternity, they carry water that drains out before reaching its destination, making their labor perpetually pointless. But this isn't just busy work, it's a precisely crafted metaphor for their crime. They had been vessels for their father's will, carrying out his commands without question, just as they now carry water without purpose. They had emptied their marriages of meaning by murdering their husbands, just as their jars empty of water despite their efforts. The punishment mirrors the crime with the precision of a master artist, but the truly disturbing detail is the exception. Hypermnestra, who refused to murder her husband, was initially put on trial by her father for disobedience. The only sister who showed mercy was the one punished by mortals, while those who committed murder were only punished by gods. The message is clear in the Greek universe: family loyalty trumps marriage vows, and obedience to parents matters more than mercy. To spouses, the punishment of Sisyphus reveals even more about divine psychology. Condemned to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, with the stone rolling back down just before reaching the top, Sisyphus experiences the most refined form of torture imaginable: hope followed by inevitable disappointment, repeated forever. But Sisyphus's crimes weren't particularly heinous by mythological standards. He was crafty. He cheated death a couple of times, and he told on Zeus for abducting a river god's daughter. His real offense was being too clever for his own good, outwitting death and the gods through cunning rather than strength. The boulder punishment is almost beautiful in its symbolic precision. Sisyphus was always striving for something just out of reach: mortality, divine secrets, power over death itself. Now he strives forever for a goal that remains perpetually unattainable. His greatest strength persists, the mechanism of his torment. The gods didn't just want to punish Sisyphus, they wanted to break his spirit by forcing him to experience hope and failure in an endless cycle. Every time he pushes the boulder up the mountain, he must believe that this time might be different, that his effort might finally succeed. The moment of the stone's inevitable fall becomes a small death repeated for eternity. What makes Greek mythology truly disturbing isn't the individual stories. It's the way they fit together into a coherent worldview where suffering is inevitable, justice is arbitrary, and love is indistinguishable from destruction. These myths created a psychological landscape where trauma was the normal state of existence and recovery was impossible. The gods were omnipresent but unreliable, offering protection that could be withdrawn without warning and love that could transform into hatred based on incomprehensible divine logic. Mortals lived in constant fear of accidental transgression, knowing that a chance encounter with a bathing goddess or an unguarded comment about divine beauty could result in transformation, death, or generational curses. Family relationships, which should provide safety and support, were the primary vectors of harm. Parents ate children, children murdered parents, siblings betrayed each other, and spouses became enemies. The basic human bonds that make civilization possible were repeatedly shown to be fragile, conditional, and potentially lethal. Even heroism was tainted by inevitable tragedy. Heroes might save cities and slay monsters, but their personal lives were always disasters. They lost their families to their quests, their friends to their fame, and their sanity to their achievements. The greater their heroic deeds, the more complete their personal destruction. The myths taught that wisdom was dangerous, beauty was a curse, and power corrupted everyone who touched it. They created a universe where the best possible outcome was to live and die unnoticed by the gods, where anonymity was the highest form of blessing and invisibility the greatest protection. Standing here in the ruins of ancient Greece, surrounded by the whispers of these stories, you begin to understand why the Greeks invented democracy, philosophy, and theater. They weren't trying to create a perfect society, they were trying to build something humane in a universe designed by psychopaths. They knew the gods were monsters. The heroes were doomed, and fate was inescapable. But somehow, in the face of all this cosmic horror, they still believed in trying to be better. That might be the most disturbing truth of all, that humans could look directly at this mythological nightmare and still choose to build civilization, create beauty, and seek wisdom. The sun is setting over Olympus, and you can hear the gods laughing, cruel and beautiful and utterly indifferent to your existence. But in that laughter, you hear something else, the echo of human voices refusing to be silenced, telling stories that make sense of senseless suffering, creating meaning from meaningless pain. Welcome to Greek mythology, where even the happy endings are written in blood, but humans keep writing them anyway. You've survived the cannibalism, the sexual violence, and the eternal tortures. But now we enter the darkest territory of all, divine madness, where the gods don't just kill you, they break your mind first, forcing you to destroy everything you love with your own hands, while remaining fully aware of what you're doing. The gods understood something that modern horror writers are still trying to master. Physical death is temporary, but psychological destruction is eternal. When Zeus wanted to truly punish someone, he didn't send lightning bolts, he sent madness. Consider the daughters of King Proetus of Argos. who made the fatal mistake of claiming they were more beautiful than Hera. The goddess's response wasn't to disfigure them or kill them, it was to drive them insane with the delusion that they were cows. Picture these three princesses, raised in luxury and refinement, suddenly convinced they were cattle. They began walking on all fours, lowing like cows, trying to graze on grass and flowers. But the madness went deeper than mere behavior. They genuinely believed their human bodies were transforming into bovine forms. They would spend hours examining their hands, convinced they were seeing hooves, running their fingers through their hair and feeling horns growing from their skulls. The psychological torture was exquisite in its precision. They retained enough human intelligence to feel shame about their behavior, but the delusion was so complete they couldn't stop themselves. They knew they were princesses, knew they should be conducting themselves with dignity, but they were compelled to act like livestock in front of their horrified subjects. Their madness was contagious. It spread to other women in Argos, creating a city full of women who believed they were cattle. Imagine the social collapse. Wives abandoning their families to graze in fields, mothers trying to nurse their babies while convinced they were cows, noble ladies stripping off their clothes because they believed their skin was growing udders. Cure was almost as disturbing as the curse. The prophet Melampus agreed to heal them, but demanded 1/3 of the kingdom as payment, and when the king hesitated, Melampus raised his price to 2/3. The message was clear. Even relief from divine punishment came at ruinous cost, and mortals had no choice but to pay whatever price the gods' agents demanded. But the most horrifying example of divine madness was the fate of Pentheus, king of Thebes, who refused to acknowledge Dionysus as a god. Dionysus's revenge was to drive all the women of Thebes mad during his religious festivals, sending them into the mountains to engage in frenzied rituals that combined religious ecstasy with homicidal violence. Pentheus's own mother, Agave, was among the maddened women. When Pentheus disguised himself to spy on the forbidden rituals, the women, led by Agave, fell upon him in their divine frenzy. They tore him apart with their bare hands, convinced in their madness that they were killing a wild boar that threatened their sacred rites. Agave carried her son's head back to Thebes as a trophy, still lost in divine madness, proudly showing off what she believed was the head of a fierce beast she had slain in defense of the god. She called for her father and son to come see her magnificent kill, not understanding that she was displaying her child's severed head to his grandfather. The moment of recognition when the madness lifted and Agave realized she was holding her son's head represents one of the most psychologically devastating scenes in all of mythology. Picture that instant when divine delusion cracked and human awareness flooded back. The weight of the head in her hands, the familiar features coming into focus, the understanding that her motherly pride was actually proof of the most unnatural crime imaginable. Dionysus had crafted a punishment that turned maternal love into infanticide, religious devotion into familial destruction, and protective instincts into murderous rage. Agave didn't just lose her son, she became the instrument of his death, her hands forever stained with his blood, her memory forever poisoned by the knowledge of what she had done while believing she was serving the gods. While Zeus represents masculine divine violence through rape and transformation, the female divine figures in Greek mythology specialize in psychological torture that makes his brutality seem almost merciful by comparison. These goddesses understood that the most effective revenge wasn't quick death, it was slow psychological dissolution. 2. Fura Selecto, Megahera. and Tisiphone were perhaps the most terrifying divine beings in the Greek pantheon because they represented guilt made manifest. Born from the blood of Uranus when Cronus castrated him, they were living embodiments of cosmic justice that pursued the guilty relentlessly, driving them insane through psychological torture rather than physical violence. Their appearance alone was designed to inspire madness. Serpents for hair that writhed and hissed with each movement, eyes that wept blood instead of tears, wings like a bat's that blocked out the sun when they flew overhead. But their true horror wasn't physical, it was their ability to make their victims relive their crimes endlessly, experiencing every moment of guilt and shame in an eternal loop of psychological torment. When Orestes killed his mother, Clytemnestra, to avenge his father Agamemnon's murder, the Furies pursued him across the known world. They didn't try to kill him, they simply followed him, whispering descriptions of his crime, forcing him to remember the moment when his sword entered his mother's flesh, the sound she made as she died, the look in her eyes when she realized her son was murdering her. The Furies' voices would echo in his head day and night, describing his matricide in vivid detail, questioning his motives, listing his mother's virtues, reminding him of every kindness she had shown him as a child. They turned his memory into a weapon against himself, making sleep impossible because his dreams were filled with his mother's accusations. But Clytemnestra herself had been an even more disturbing figure before her death, a woman who had spent 10 years planning the perfect revenge against her husband for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia. Her patience was inhuman in its calculation, decade after decade of playing the faithful wife while nurturing her hatred, preparing for the moment when Agamemnon would return victorious from Troy so she could destroy him at the height of his triumph. When Agamemnon finally came home, Clytemnestra greeted him with apparent joy, preparing a feast in his honor and offering him a ritual bath to cleanse away the stains of war. She personally helped him into the bath, then threw a net over him, trapping him naked and helpless before hacking him to death with an axe. The symbolism was perfect. Agamemnon, the great warrior who had conquered Troy, died naked and defenseless. In his own home, killed by the woman who should have been his greatest comfort. Clytemnestra had turned the rituals of homecoming, the feast, the bath, the marital bed into instruments of execution. But perhaps the most disturbing female figure was Circe, whose magic represented the horror of losing human identity entirely. When Odysseus's men landed on her island, she welcomed them with apparent hospitality, offering food and wine that contained powerful drugs. As they ate, she transformed them into pig's butt, pigs that retained their human consciousness. Think about the psychological horror of this transformation, retaining your human mind while trapped in a pig's body, remembering your wife and children while grunting and rooting in mud, understanding language but unable to speak, wanting to stand, upright but compelled to walk on 4 legs. The men could see each other's transformation, recognizing their companions' human eyes looking out from swine faces. Knowing they appeared equally monstrous to their friends, Circe kept them as pets, feeding them acorns and slop while they retained their human dignity and shame. They had to eat like animals to survive, had to wallow in filth because that was their nature now, had to submit to being herded and penned like livestock while their human souls screamed in protest. The worst part was the permanence without divine intervention. They would remain pigs forever, watching their human memories fade as their animal instincts grew stronger, slowly losing themselves piece by piece until nothing human remained except the knowledge that they had once been more than this. Greek mythology reserves its most disturbing transformations for children, reflecting a deep cultural anxiety about innocence, corrupted and potential destroyed. These stories suggest that in a universe ruled by capricious gods, even childhood provides no protection from cosmic horror. The story of the daughters of Minyas illustrates how quickly divine displeasure can turn normal children into monsters. When Dionysus came to their city of Orchomenus, these three sisters refused to join his festivals, preferring to stay home and work at their looms rather than engage in drunken revelry. Their punishment for this seemingly virtuous choice was swift and horrible. Dionysus drove them mad, and in their frenzy, they decided to sacrifice one of their children to the god. They drew lots to determine which sister would provide the victim, and Leucippe drew the short straw, her son. Hippasus became the offering. The three sisters tore the child apart with their bare hands, then cooked and ate his flesh in a cannibalistic feast they believed would honor Dionysus. When the madness lifted, they found themselves standing around the remains of their nephew and son, their hands and mouths stained with his blood, their stomachs full of his flesh. But the god wasn't finished with them. He transformed them into bats, condemning them to live in darkness, hanging upside down in caves. Their human voices reduced to squeaking sounds that most people found irritating rather than pitiable. They retained just enough human consciousness to remember what they had done, but lost the ability to communicate their remorse or seek forgiveness. Even more disturbing is the story of Lycaon's sons, 50 princes who decided to test Zeus's omniscience by serving him human flesh. But they didn't sacrifice a stranger or an enemy. They killed their youngest brother, the one they should have protected most carefully, and served him to the king of the gods. Zeus's response was immediate and comprehensive. He killed of the 50 brothers with lightning bolts, transforming the survivor into a wolf as a living reminder of their bestial nature. But he also brought their murdered brother back to life, forcing the surviving wolf brother to live with the knowledge that his siblings had died for nothing. Their victim had been restored. Their crime had been pointless, and their punishment was eternal. The transformation into a wolf wasn't just physical. The surviving brother retained human intelligence, but was driven by wolf instincts, including the urge to hunt and eat human flesh. He became the very monster his family had pretended to serve Zeus, condemned to live as a cannibal beast while remembering that he had once been a prince with the power to choose virtue over violence. The most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Greek mythology is its understanding of how trauma echoes through generations, creating families where violence is inherited like eye color or height. These aren't just stories about individual punishment, they're explorations of how evil perpetuates itself across time. The House of Pelops illustrates this principle with horrifying clarity. After Tantalus served his son Pelops to the gods, the family curse spread through every subsequent generation like a contagion of violence. Pelops himself, restored to life by the gods, continued the cycle by murdering Myrtilus, the charioteer who helped him win a rigged race to marry Hippodamia. As Myrtilus died, he cursed Pelops and all his descendants, ensuring that the family's violence would continue indefinitely. Pelops' sons, Atreus and Thyestes, inherited their grandfather's taste for familial cannibalism. When Thyestes seduced Atreus' wife, Atreus' revenge was to kill Thyestes' children and serve them to their father at a feast. But Thyestes had one surviving son, Aegisthus, who would eventually murder Atreus and seduce Clytemnestra while her husband Agamemnon was at war. The cycle continued. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. Clytemnestra murdered Agamemnon. Orestes killed Clytemnestra, and the Furies drove Orestes mad with guilt. Each generation believed they were breaking the cycle, that their violence was justified as revenge for previous crimes. But each act of revenge only created new grievances, new victims who would grow up planning their own retaliation. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was psychological. The way trauma creates traumatizers, how the abused become abusers, how violence teaches violence. The House of Cadmus provides another example of generational doom. Cadmus founded Thebes by slaying a dragon sacred to Ares, then sowing the dragon's teeth in the ground. Armed warriors sprang up from the earth, fought each other until only 5 survived, then helped Cadmus build his city. But Ares never forgave the killing of his dragon, and the curse on Cadmus's family lasted for generations. His daughter, Semele, was incinerated when she demanded to see Zeus in his true form. His grandson, Actaeon, was torn apart by his own hunting. Dogs, his great-grandson Pentheus was dismembered by his mother and aunts during a Dionysiac frenzy. His descendant Oedipus murdered his father and married his mother, while Oedipus's children killed each other in civil war. Each tragedy seemed unrelated to the others, but they were all connected by the original crime-killing Ares dragon. The curse manifested differently in each generation, but always involved family members destroying each other, as if the violent foundation of the city had infected every relationship within its walls. As you stand here in the ruins of ancient Greece, surrounded by these whispered horrors, a disturbing pattern emerges. The gods don't just rule mortals, they feed on them, emotionally and psychologically. Human suffering isn't an unfortunate side effect of divine rule. It's the entire point. The gods are cosmic parasites, beings who require mortal worship, fear, and anguish to maintain their power and relevance. They don't want to be loved, they want to be needed, and the best way to ensure that need is to create problems that only divine intervention can solve. Then demand payment for solutions that often create worse problems. Consider how many myths follow the same pattern. A god creates a problem, curse, monster, plague. Mortals suffer horribly while trying to solve it themselves. They finally appeal to the gods for help. The gods demand enormous sacrifices in exchange for assistance, and the solution often creates new problems for future generations to suffer through. Zeus doesn't send monsters to test heroes, he sends them to create heroes. The suffering isn't incidental to the heroism. It's the raw material from which heroism is manufactured. Heracles doesn't become great despite his labors. He becomes great because his labors generate stories that make people worship the gods who designed his trials. The oracle at Delphi represents this system at its most refined. People travel hundreds of miles to ask the god Apollo questions about their futures, paying enormous fees for cryptic answers that almost always lead to the very disasters they were trying to avoid. The prophecies don't predict fate, they create it, ensuring that mortals remain trapped in cycles of seeking divine guidance that only makes their problems worse. But the most disturbing aspect of this divine parasitism is how it corrupts human relationships. The gods don't just demand worship, they demand that mortals choose divine loyalty over human loyalty, that they sacrifice their children, betray their friends, and abandon their principles to prove their devotion. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac becomes the model for proper divine relationship, complete submission to divine will, even when that will contradicts every human instinct for love, protection, and justice. The gods test mortals not to see if they're good people, but to See if they're willing to stop being good people when divine authority demands it. What makes Greek mythology truly terrifying isn't the individual stories, it's the complete worldview they create. This is a universe where safety is always temporary and usually illusory. No matter how careful you are, how virtuous your behavior, or how powerful your protections, divine whim can destroy everything you value in an instant. Love is dangerous. The deeper your emotional connections, the more vulnerable you become to divine manipulation. Your greatest weakness is always the person you can't bear to lose. Wisdom is punishable. The more clearly you see divine injustice, the more likely you are to be destroyed for that clarity. Ignorance is protection. Understanding is doom. Virtue is arbitrary. The same action can be heroic or criminal depending on divine mood. Moral principles provide no reliable guidance because the gods operate by different rules that change without notice. Death is not escape. The afterlife is just another realm of divine control, where punishment can continue indefinitely. Even oblivion is denied to those who displease the gods. These myths created a psychological environment of chronic hypervigilance, where mortals lived in constant fear of invisible threats they couldn't predict or prevent. Every natural disaster might be divine punishment for unknown crimes. Every stroke of good fortune might be a setup for future catastrophe. Every relationship might be a trap designed by hostile gods. The Greeks understood something about trauma that modern psychology is only beginning to recognize: when the world is fundamentally unsafe, when authority figures are unpredictable and violent, when love becomes a weapon, the normal human responses are paranoia, hypervigilance, and emotional numbing. But here's the truly disturbing question. Why did the Greeks tell these stories? Why did they create and preserve myths that painted their gods as sadistic predators and their heroes as doomed victims? What cultural purpose did these nightmares serve? The answer lies in understanding that these myths weren't escapist entertainment, were psychological preparation for living in a world where power was absolute, arbitrary, and always potentially hostile. Ancient Greece was a world of tyrants, plagues, invasions, and natural disasters that could destroy cities overnight. The myths taught survival skills for navigating dangerous power structures. They showed that flattery was safer than honesty, that invisibility was preferable to fame, that emotional attachment was vulnerability, and that the powerful would always sacrifice the weak when convenient. They also provided a framework for understanding seemingly random suffering. When your city was destroyed by earthquake, your children died of plague, or your family was scattered by war, the myths suggested that these weren't meaningless tragedies. They were part of larger patterns of divine behavior that could be studied and, to some extent, predicted. The stories served as warnings about the dangers of hubris, but not the modern understanding of hubris as arrogance. In Greek terms, hubris was any action that attracted divine attention, being too beautiful, too talented, too happy, too successful, or too virtuous. The myths taught that excellence itself was dangerous, that standing out from the crowd was often fatal. But perhaps most importantly, the myths provided emotional outlets for rage that couldn't be safely expressed in daily life. People living under tyrannical rulers couldn't openly criticize their governments, but they could tell stories about gods who behaved exactly like tyrants, who were petty, vindictive, sexually predatory, and utterly indifferent to justice. The myths allowed people to acknowledge truths about power that would have been treasonous if stated directly: that rulers were often monsters, that justice was usually unavailable to ordinary people, that the powerful preyed on the weak with impunity, and that virtue provided no protection against systematic violence. Standing here in the shadows of Olympus, you realize that these ancient horrors haven't really disappeared, they've just changed costumes. The same patterns of abuse, the same corruption of power, the same cycles of trauma and revenge play out in modern headlines with depressing regularity. We still live in a world where the powerful prey on the vulnerable, where justice is often unavailable to those who need it most, where entire families can be destroyed by the actions of previous generations, where love can be weaponized, and where truth-telling is frequently punished rather than rewarded. The gods may be dead, but the systems they represented, arbitrary authority, capricious justice, the worship of power over principle, are alive and well. We've simply replaced divine whim with market forces, prophetic curses with generational poverty, and transformation punishments with social media destruction. The Greek myths remain relevant because they accurately describe the psychological landscape of living under hostile authority. They provide a vocabulary for discussing trauma, a framework for understanding how evil perpetuates itself, and most importantly, examples of how people can maintain their humanity even in the face of cosmic indifference. The most disturbing truth about Greek mythology isn't the violence, the cruelty, or the cosmic injustices that the ancient Greeks looked directly at this nightmare and still chose to build civilization. They knew the gods were monsters, the heroes were doomed, and fate was inescapable. But they still created art, philosophy, democracy, and theater. They developed ethical systems, knowing that the universe was fundamentally unethical. They pursued truth, knowing that truth was often punished. They formed loving relationships, knowing that love made them vulnerable to destruction. They created beauty, knowing that beauty attracted dangerous attention. This wasn't optimism, it was something far more profound and courageous. It was the decision to be human despite living in an inhuman universe, to create meaning despite meaningless suffering, to choose virtue despite the absence of cosmic justice. The Greeks understood that we don't get to choose whether we live in a tragic universe, we only get to choose how we respond to that tragedy. We can become monsters ourselves, join the cycle of abuse and violence, and add our own cruelty to the cosmic sum. Or we can refuse to participate, maintaining our humanity as an act of rebellion against inhuman systems. Standing here as the sun sets over ancient Greece, you hear something in the wind that isn't divine laughter, it's human voices, generation after generation, telling these stories not to terrorize their children, but to prepare them, not to encourage despair, but to cultivate the kind of courage that can face ultimate darkness and still choose to light a candle. The myths don't promise happy endings, because life doesn't provide them, but they do promise that how we face our endings matters, that our choices have meaning even in meaningless circumstances, and that maintaining our humanity in the face of cosmic horror is perhaps the most heroic act possible. The gods may have been monsters, but they created something they never intended, a species capable of recognizing monstrosity and choosing to be different. That may be the only victory available to mortals, but it's enough. Welcome to Greek mythology, where the happy endings are written in blood, but where humans keep writing them anyway, and where the greatest triumph isn't avoiding tragedy, it's remaining human despite experiencing it. The stories end here, but the choice continues. How will you write your own myth in a world that still worships power over principle, that still transforms victims into monsters, that still demands sacrifices to indifferent gods? The ancient Greeks left us more than nightmares. They left us a choice. Choose wisely. The gods are watching, and they're still laughing. But now you know what they're really laughing at. Their own inability to destroy the human capacity for hope, love, and moral courage. That laughter sounds different now, doesn't it? Less like cosmic victory and more like cosmic frustration. The gods may be immortal, but they're also trapped, forever dealing with mortals who insist on being better than their creators. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing truth of all.